Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Matt Beane, who is in technology management at UCSB, UC Santa Barbara, for those of you who don't know, and also the author of this book called The Skill Code, How to Save Human Ability in an Age of Intelligent Machines. And, you know, Matt, I think you probably could have given it a different subtitle, because while the book is about the impact of technology on work and the transmission of what we might think of as tacit knowledge, I mean, it covers a whole lot more. I mean, it covers also what I think of as the industrial organization of knowledge transmission, right? How and where knowledge transmission takes place, and how the economics of that is impacting the degree to which this knowledge is transferred through these different channels. And so that I really enjoyed. And the other thing I think I really liked about this book is that even though it is primarily about the transmission of work-related knowledge, the theory is broad enough to cover teaching in the classroom as well as parenting, right? And so I've done a bunch of other podcasts on parenting, and we tend to see the same sort of thing happening where we're relying much more on the explicit transmission of knowledge, right? Where people, if they want to learn to be parents, they go read a book on it, right? And also when it comes to teaching your kids how to do chores, the tendency now is to just tell your kids to go and play, because they're kind of muck it up. Yep. Right.
Yeah.
And so, I guess I'm kind of going all over the place, but I think somewhere in the book you said that American companies spend about $500 billion on learning and development, and that's explicit expenditure. But if we were to actually tabulate the true expenditure that companies make with respect to training their employees, it's got to be many times that, right? Because the process of incubating new employees is a drag to some degree on the productivity of the experts. And that's one of the reasons why we're tending to see it get undermined, is precisely because it is so costly. So, okay, so let me start off by asking a question. I'm going to ask a question. Yeah. You did a lot of field research to get this book going, which suggests that the way in which you learn about learning requires that you learn through some careful observation and osmosis. Why is that? How did you do that? How did you think to undertake this project, which is a really quite broad project?
Right. Well, first off, the main thing to say is I'm delighted that you reached out, and not least because you've got such a broad palette of conversations that you cross. So I can't not react to the parenting times school times business conversation and a couple of other earlier comments before I jump to field work. So the first thing to say is I'm many things, but one of them is I'm a pedant. And so, that's part of how I've succeeded here. And so the choice of skill versus knowledge is very explicit and deliberate. And I do think there are lots of arguments about that, but practically I will say you can have lots of knowledge and no skill.
Well, the Greeks had different words for it too, right? So, logos and techne, right?
Correct. And I'm only concerned with techne. If it also includes logos, wonderful. So in other words, and knowledge is table stakes for developing skill, is the frame of this book. And so in many cases, I'm just concerned with the ability to reliably do something under pressure. That's skill. And sometimes that requires book knowledge, conceptual understanding. So that's the key thing to say. That's the answer, sort of, to the fieldwork question, because it's pretty straightforward at an arm's length to study knowledge, production, transmission, utilization, so on, because you're dealing with trace data whether it's the printed word on a piece of vellum, or it's DMs or files be exchanged or what have you, job aid, that kind of thing. But if you're looking for the production of the ability to reliably do something under pressure, in many cases that'll require a bunch of explicit records-based whatever. But to check whether your view on how skill is actually developed is accurate, or to develop new theories that explain how it's actually developed, you have to go watch work. Because humans, that's the first third of the book. The science there is pretty boring and uncontroversial. You learn through contact with a real problem, failure, recovery, but typically and best when there's somebody around who knows a little bit more than you do, heaven forbid. And so that's what drives you into the field. So now, if there weren't disruption going on, there's no imperative for fieldwork. Fieldwork is, firsthand data is extremely frustrating, expensive, confusing to generate and make sure that it's high quality, because you can get garbage observation data pretty straightforwardly as well, or data that just isn't defensively scientific, right? You go see something happen once and you go, hey, look, this is a thing. And it's like, it needs to be repeatedly so and independently repeatedly so. So you have that takes a lot of work. And unless there's something interesting and new going on, you better be careful about using that method. So I had robotics and AI hitting our shores. Robotic surgery was early. Profession that sort of had 10 years under its belt. So not brand new, like they'd sort of figured things out to a degree. And yet, compared to the global economy, quite early. So it's a good place to go looking for patterns that might reflect what we're about to experience. And the story there, I think, so fine. Yes, that worked. I discovered that it's just practically easier to work without a novice to get your job done with this new crop of intelligent technologies. And so the expert's going to take that deal. We love solving problems. We're an expert. If we can do it alone, it's just inherently more satisfying and motivating. It's an intrinsic motivation kind of thing. But also you can produce more value for those that you intend to serve alone, faster. And so they'll take that deal. So will the organization. They love that. ROI. It's pretty straightforward. As you said, another way to say what you said is novices are slower and make more mistakes by definition. That's what they are. And so why would you involve a novice in the work unless you had to? And the history of human progress has been work that required, because of our biology, our cognitive apparatus, you can't get certain jobs done without multiple human beings. And so that necessity, one of the coolest things I dug up for the book, I guess this is a pun, is the archaeology of skill. Basically goes back 160,000 years to the production of this first stored energy weapon, the bow. And we have piles of rock that show that people were gathering raw materials from the environment to bring together so that somebody could synthesize them into a valuable component, say an arrow. And it's just obvious you wouldn't send that skilled person out into the woods to go grab those rocks. And so yes, it's a drag on the experts to have those novices involved, but they're also strictly necessary. It's a must that you have that person involved. So it's good for everybody. You achieve something otherwise impossible. Now, especially in this generative AI moment, just that many more experts can race ahead that much farther with no human involvement aside from their own. That's the problem.
Right. So before we ever had any kind of system of formal education, the way in which you would learn practical skills is through some kind of apprenticeship, right? And, this could be as a kid helping your mom in the kitchen. This could be as a kid, helping your dad out in the field. Or if it was outside of the family structure, right, you would go in at the bottom and kind of work your way to the top. Now, the question then would be, why, how does this benefit the people who are kind of helping you, coaching you, exposing you to this sophisticated way of doing things? And you pointed out one, which is the division of labor makes it possible that you might have a comparative advantage in doing some menial thing, and then you kind of learn simply through osmosis, right? Just by kind of being in the room and paying attention. But there's another possibility, which is that the organization, the entity, will be there to recoup the investment, right? So if you are, for instance, a junior attorney, you're not, you might not make any money for the firm in the first year or two, but they expect to have you around during your most profitable period, right? Yeah. And if it's a family, then the idea is that you deeply care about your kid and you want your kid to be successful, and so
exactly right.
Kind of a pay it forward. So I think part of this story is the technological one, where there is no real comparative advantage to being an amateur in the room. You're not doing anything. You're not adding any value. But the other has to do, I think, with this movement towards like eat what you kill.
Yes.
Right. And the idea that, hey, if we spend all this time training this junior doctor or attorney, they're going to leave, and someone else is going to bear reap the benefits of this person who's kind of learning the ropes, right?
Yes, and in well-developed, or let's just say more complicated versions of reality as of the last, say, 100 years, that's also just fine, because, say, for the surgical profession, that's kind of ground zero for me, at least at the beginning of my research journey on all this. It's just well understood that you're going to get trained in one institution, go to another for specialized training, i.e. a residency in my case, robotic surgery or urologic surgery. And then you're going to move from there to another institution for maybe a fellowship, which is hyper-specialized training, and then you'll land somewhere. And in all cases, you're delivering increasing value to the firm, so to speak, the organization that manages that process. And then you'll land somewhere fine. And there's this sort of invisible college, which is the profession that is running the show. And the institutions benefit enough. Trust me, I've dealt with CFOs at major, the top teaching hospitals in the States, and not one of them would advocate for including residents in a surgical procedure. Mm-hmm. They are always asking, let's put it this way. The implied conversation is, so you're not doing 4 procedures a day because there's residents in the room. Now you can only do 3. Mm-hmm. You sure that's a necessary thing on Tuesday? And surgeons feel that strong pressure. So it's not, everyone recognizes there's a tax involved. It's just these days, when that resident is strictly optional, utterly not necessary for getting the work done, then the surgeon goes to their chief and says, when do you want me to introduce more mistakes and delay into my procedures?
Yeah.
What is the right time to do that?
You cited some statistics about how much longer the surgery is, and how much more anesthesia the patient is exposed to, right? So it's not only costly for the institution; it's costly for the patient, right? To have this intern or resident working on them, right?
Not in all cases. That's, of course, statistics are lies, of course. So there are some institutions at which residents are one order of magnitude faster and better than a full-blown surgeon at another institution. So you got to put it in context. But yes, in general, the minute that junior person isn't needed to get the job done, then we have a new problem. And that's just that there is no party who is going to fight for their involvement aside for that junior person, but they've never done it before, so they actually don't know how it used to be done. They're not in a good position to say, hey, wait a minute, I'm cut out of the action. So there's nobody who owns the problem, so to speak.
Now, look, a lot of the book is really about learning, right? And how learning takes place. And, as an academic, I'm tempted to kind of defend explicit knowledge and codified knowledge. And, we see that more and more of people's training and education takes place in these formal environments, right? Where, whether it's the classroom, right? Or, it could be through book reading and so forth. And Now, do we overestimate the kind of efficacy of that sort of knowledge transmission? Do we sort of in the academy think that we can dispense with learning by doing and on-the-job training?
I would say the implicit working theory of academia is exactly that. Yes, it is inverted it is at odds with the research. So it's just very patently, now, if you sat any instructor, any teacher who really cared about students and delivering a quality experience and leaving those students better off than they were before and say, what do you think is the best way for your students to learn? They will all recite something that is closer to what I've got in this book, which is, oh yeah, you got to have them working on real problems that actually are contextualized to them, that matter to them, collaboratively. You want somebody involved who knows what they're doing. They want to get real high quality feedback, all that stuff. And we just give them this. So they'll spout off a theory that is very consistent with learn by doing. And the practical reality is that it's very hard to scale that this is the 2 Sigma problem that, we've known about for decades in education. And so it's cost effective to deliver something that doesn't work. And it is not cost effective to deliver something that does. And so we have the proverbial street light is pointing straight down at a training target. And I'm going to give you the printed word instead and talk at you. And that is a structural problem. It's a sociological problem. You can have very well-intended actors who care a lot and are trying to right the wrongs of their own insufficient education. In fact, that's me. And you're just playing inside a cage that's impossible to really, or not impossible, actually. It is not impossible, but it's just, you should predict then that folks are going to default to the cost-effective route.
Yeah, no, I mean, we've known this, right? So a lot of the theories of learning that you articulate in the book, I mean, they've been around for a long time. I mean, I went to a Montessori school in the early 1970s, and it was remarkably effective, and it utilized this idea of, the zone of proximal development and the guide who is available. I mean, all the things that you articulate were there in Montessori education. And yet, fast forward 50 years, we don't really see a higher proportion of education taking place through Montessori methods. And even in business school, it seems like we're constantly fighting this battle. I've just seen the case method gradually diminish and dwindle and almost disappear in my business schools. And then we periodically have these bursts of like, hey, we need to do experiential learning.
Yes.
And then we do it, and then, it kind of starts fading. It's like every couple of years we have to try and, bring it back. I mean, it does seem like there's some kind of, law of entropy that forces educational institutions away from the stuff that really works.
Yes, and I think it is very kind of obvious and straightforward, actually. It's just that the delivering a knowledge-focused curriculum and getting people to pass tests that they've demonstrated that they've acquired conceptual knowledge and some capability around articulating that, which is skill, writing, doing math, that kind of stuff, which are critical. There's sort of price of entry for doing valuable work. I don't diminish that. If you have millions and millions of people to serve and you have tens of thousands of people to serve them, you're trapped. The workplace is ground zero. And so for that kind of skill development, and maybe that's just fine, by the way, and maybe the right solution, I went through an experience that was very much like Montessori for high school, actually. My graduating class was 16 people, and that was shockingly large for my institution. You call your teacher by their first name. You decide what your learning objectives are for the year. You have huge amounts of autonomy and so on. It was great for me, and boy, is that costly. That was a private school, right? I was lucky to get a scholarship, but it's just not cost effective. So I wouldn't call it entropy so much as the supply and demand problem. And I think this is sort of what I poke at in the back third of my book. I do think that the very technologies that are at the heart of the disruption it's in the middle of the book, I have data now to show that it is possible systematically for us to solve this problem in new ways, or at least to try, and we must, because sacrificing our skill development capability right now, I mean, that's the worst possible moment to be doing that. So anyway, I'm guardedly optimistic that we have a reasonable shot at it, and it's time to try.
Well, maybe you can articulate, what the skill code is. I mean, you basically, you use the DNA analogy and, the four parts of DNA, and you say, right, you've got to have the optimal amount of, it's not just that you have to have challenge, you have to have the optimal amount of challenge, the optimal amount of complexity, and the optimal amount of connection in order for tacit knowledge, techne, to flow, right, from those that have it to those that don't.
Yes. And it felt a little hokey to do, but it also feels useful. And so I went with this 3 C's thing, challenge, complexity, and connection.
Is that your idea or your editor's idea?
No, it was mine. Yeah, it was mine. Because I wanted this book to be useful, and part of what makes something useful is that it's sticky and memorable. And the 3 C's thing, I think, and it's working. People can have that in their back pocket, and they're like, whoa, okay, what do all those 3 things mean? Even I do that. Challenge, you mentioned zones of proximal development before. Basically across, I think I covered 14 scientific disciplines. The basic idea is that humans build techne, build skill optimally when you are working close to but not at the edge of your capability. You are not performing as well as you otherwise could, and you are utterly focused.
This is related to flow in a sense, although flow is really about, when you're executing on a task as opposed to, scaffolding some skill, but it's similar.
The difference between flow and a challenge state is that it is not a pleasant experience. There's this feeling of strain and struggle. There's a wonderful quote I think it's in one of my, the first paper that I published on this, where I had a surgical resident say, I really learned a lot by operating when the attending wasn't in the room, which they're not supposed to be doing. The attending would come back in and say, "Oh, you really were struggling on that bleeder for a while there, huh?" And he goes, "Yeah, well, how'd you tell?" And he said, "Because that console is all sweaty." And so, the difference between flow and this kind of challenge position is that you can do much more in many cases with an expert there to scaffold you to greater heights. Part of that is giving you healthier target selection, helping you see the opportunities clearer. The other part of it, though, is frustration management, because it's an emotional drain to be that close to the edge of your capability. If somebody's there to put it in context, to say, good, you hit a foul ball in the major leagues today. Good job. Tomorrow may be a base. You'll get on base. And that turns a failure into progress to success for someone. Mm-hmm. So that's challenge. Complexity is...
But before we move on to complexity,
sure.
I mean, so it's kind of like the Yerkes-Dodson law, right? Where there's an optimal amount of stress. I teach case method in my classes, and I tell my students, if you're not uncomfortable at some point in this class, you're probably not learning. And I've discovered that that's not a very popular.
Doesn't get you good ratings as an instructor.
It's not a popular form. I wish that I could get the ratings like a year later instead of like right at the end of the class.
Or get ratings based on their ability to produce the behavior in context. How about that?
Yeah,
right.
But I mean, but the only reason why you get bad ratings is simply because I think that for some reason, the students have been educated to think that discomfort is in some way a problem, right?
Well, and that gets to, I remember writing up the proposal for this book, and my agent told me, the coddling of the American mind is very proximate to your book in a way. This challenge bit, like the world in a certain sense, especially in America, I would say in the last 40 years, has become a bit of a padded playground on numerous dimensions. At work, at school. And humans do not like feeling uncomfortable. The findings there are 50 years old and very uncontroversial. And we engineer social systems to avoid feeling uncomfortable, me or you. And in many cases, that's fine. But when it comes to skill development, that can be toxic. Feeling uncomfortable is a good sign.
I mean, I think that athletes and military, ex-military, they seem to be the ones that embrace this because they've experienced a lot of discomfort. I had a professor at Wharton who said, you're confused. Confusion is 90% of the way to wisdom. Sure. I always remembered that quote.
Yes, and that gets down to healthy challenge, because it's not just, you said an amount of challenge. I worked hard in the book to say there's 10, I gave, in each of these 3 C's, I give the reader a 10-point checklist on the sort of your 10-point inspection on the health of those 3 things in your context. And so there are multiple dimensions of challenge. Some of it has to do with how your personal performance. Some of it has to do with the people around you. Some of it has to do with how much time away from the task you get, for instance. Yeah. You need recovery time, for instance. Anyway, but in principle, yes, the what we need to build skill is culturally, we've got a bit of a cultural problem writ large, especially in education. And you're right. I think there's some occupations, professions, sectors of the economy where folks are like, you're doing trauma response, feeling uncomfortable, or you're walking a beat. Or for me, being trained as a field researcher, to bring it back to the beginning, I had good instructors who said, look, when you get into a moment and you realize, you're uncomfortable asking for permission to view a certain behavior or something, that's when you absolutely must say, may I please get into that room, right? Because that's a sign that you're touching the edges of a part of this phenomena that is energized, is important. And you need to cultivate the ability to invert that feeling of uncomfortableness into a signal that you must proceed towards the difficulty. Anyway, it's not like it's ailing everywhere, but I do think if left unchecked, people will just stay away.
Yeah, and you also say that you need to be in an environment of optimal complexity, and I really enjoyed the parallels to machine learning, right? And how machines learn also better in an environment of optimal complexity.
Yes. And the short story there is where challenge you can maybe think of as getting good at a focused task, whether it's writing a research brief or tying a surgical knot. That's critical for learning. But healthy skill development makes you robust to circumstance. And for machine learning and for human learning. And the way that occurs is that as you progress towards skill in a particular area, you digest and consume collateral work. You make sense of your environment, the other jobs, tasks, skills, data that are flowing through what you're doing. So a surgeon, for instance, might say, I wonder how this institution makes money. Or that nurse over there, what she's on a PC, what's she doing? That kind of stuff, such that on a random Thursday, if something goes sideways in a procedure, a very good surgeon not only can handle the trauma, but also can understand why it is occurring today. That's because the supplies only get restocked on Wednesdays around here, and Janet is the one who brings those up. And so they, in fact, a good surgeon will text Janet 2 days ahead of that surge and say, hey, just remember, I need those extra bovies and cautery supplies up here. And they will be there. And all other surgeons who haven't digested that complexity will be shocked that, wait, why are Tuesdays so hard? So there's this sort of going broad as much as going deep. That's the complexity bit.
Well, you also talk about how rules and discretion can sometimes be complements, but sometimes they can be substitutes, right? And so, I think a lot of us have this notion that, anything we want to convert, once people use their discretion in a way that stumbles upon something that works, we want to convert it into a rule and then strip away the discretion. But I think you're arguing that there's a crowding out that takes place, right? So if somebody is too rule bound, then their ability to develop good discretion atrophies, right?
Yes, exactly right. There are marvelous studies of this in sports psychology and kinesiology, where you essentially, and it's even, I mean, in colloquial English, we call people who are rule bound in sports chokers, like somebody who's thinking about
or whatever,
right?
Yeah,
thinking about how they're doing the free throw mechanically as they're doing it. You are done. You're toast. And so rules are useful, but in a and this has to do with this complexity bit, like when and how. It's not just do I engage with complexity, it's when and how. Before game time, during the game, definitely not. But even in advance, there's numerous fine-grained different ways of when is the right time to consume conceptual knowledge, including formalized rules, guidelines for how to do the work. And the answer is basically don't read the manual before you start to try to use the VCR. Like minimum exposure, go try. That's a better time to rock back towards the conceptual.
Well, I mean, I guess if there was a steady state, right, then it would be less important. But,
that's right.
We don't live in a steady state, right?
Exactly.
I mean, in the educational environment, oftentimes, if I assign a project to students, oftentimes, and these are, MBA students, they'll ask for, detailed templates, right? To tell me exactly, what are you looking for? And I'm like, just go find a problem and, try to come up with an analysis. And they kind of, they flounder a bit, but it's, I have a sense of what I think is a very good paper in my head, and I'm going to be grading according to that framework that I have. But I think that, it's important for them to discover that so that they can then use that judgment going forward when they're presented with something that doesn't have a template, right?
Right. Yes, exactly right. And that would all be well and good if the sort of state of the world was steady. Like the thing is, your expectations as to what's a healthy target, what a reasonable write-up is also, your standards are shifting themselves.
Yeah.
So that's
Surprise me. Show me something
right
that is better than what I saw last year. Right?
Exactly.
So I can update my template.
Right. Exactly right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you also say that experts sometimes become overconfident, particularly if they don't spend time reflecting. And I thought this was really profound, because when you are an expert and the opportunity cost of your time gets to be very high, the temptation is just to pack your calendar with planned work. So if you are that surgeon, it's like, well, I'm going to finish the first one at 11. I'm going to start the other one at 11:05.
Exactly
because,
right.
There's so much money at stake. How do you bake in time that you don't know ahead of time how that time is actually going to benefit you?
Right. The nice trick there, have a novice involved. So I'm being a little flip, but it's actually part of the value of this mechanism. We often think of apprenticeships as a one-way street, right? But in fact, that new person, we have tons of research on this in general. So forget novices, you put them aside. The new person in an organization, group, team, sees things that
the person asks the really dumb questions. I love this.
Exactly. And or has different experience that they're drawing on culturally, practically, technically, from outside. These days, I can't tell you the number of. I recently, I mentioned this later in the book. I authored a paper on this and have been studying it recently. This phenomena of inverted apprenticeship, where a new technology, sort of hits our shores, and the first people to understand and know about it are the junior people, are the novices, because structurally they have free time. Experts don't, as you say, they're booked. So novices, of course, are going to be the first ones messing around with AI. Not all of them, and they're not doing it well. By the way, they're not being structured about it. But are they learning stuff that you need to learn as an expert? Of course they are. And so you'll see naturally anywhere, in some way, an executive learning about TikTok from their exec assistant. I mean, that's just how this works. The novice is a critical inflow for that expert, a disturbing force. It's annoying, but also necessary to keep that expert sharp and ready to deal with today's challenges, not yesterday's.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed this in most organizations that I've worked for is that, when someone shows up as a newbie, they look around and they're like, wait, why are we doing it this way? Why aren't we doing it that way? And so forth. And, after a while, they just sort of get used to it and they sort of say, well, that's just the way it is, and it seems like the people who are the decision makers, they're often not in direct contact with the people who are asking those questions. And so they never actually realize that maybe there are, opportunities for improvement. Should people try to, deliberately expose themselves to people who are these novices, these new folks, the people who have, recently joined the organization and so forth?
Yeah. In fact, you just gave me a great idea that I wrote down. One of the main challenges I'm talking to leaders of firms and organizers for professional groups these days is about how do we deal with this whole AI thing, right? And you need structured tactics to figure out, because there are people, guaranteed, there are people in your organization, your context, your profession right now who in fact are experimenting with this stuff and discovering parts of what new success is going to look like. It's going to be imperfect. And you are very unlikely it's very unlikely that you're going to hear from them or learn about it. They're not sure that what they're doing is appropriate, so they don't have a huge incentive to say, hey, look what I'm doing here, which is not exactly what you might recommend. And of course, executives are far away from the coal, or leaders are far away from the coalface. That's just how it works. So the skip level meeting we've known about since the 50s. And also just sort of managing by walking around, all of these tactics that put you back in touch with the folks on the front line, but in particular, new folks. I think well-run organizations, by the way, do have practices for this. I haven't got data on this. I haven't studied it yet, but a savvy leader, somebody who went through an honest-to-goodness, excellent MBA program, would know darn well this problem. This is an age-old problem. Like you give your boss 80% of the truth, then that happens again and again and again, and then you're down to like 4% by 5 layers away or whatever. And so to solve that problem, a savvy leader is going to deliberately carve time out of their calendar to go and have direct, not talk at or listen to time with newbies in an organization, but let's work on a problem together time, right? So that's probably underdone, though. And the more disruptive things are, the more necessary that kind of discovery is. So I think that kind of skip level thing is, if ever there was a good time to do it, it's probably now.
Well, can you also have something like internal GitHub where people post solutions? I think Ethan Mollick, I interviewed him and he talked about, these like spell libraries, right?
Sure.
He used Harry Potter example, right? Where every organization, you post your solution and then everybody can kind of dip into it and start using it.
In theory, yeah. And Ethan's, it's funny, we started writing our books right around the same time. I started mine before, and his publisher really leaned on him to get his done first. And it's better, actually, that his was done first, because his is sort of the broad umbrella. And we're both science fiction nerds, so for any science fiction nerd listening, this is a culture reference. But I'm a knife missile in our universe, in the culture series of books, and he's the General Systems Vehicle. General Systems Vehicle is a big, giant spaceship that sort of can hold all comers, and I'm focused on this learning problem. He has one chapter in his book on that. The problem, I talk about this with some regularity. The problem, GitHub style spell library thing, magnificent. The problem is motivating people to do two things. Notice that they are doing something unusual. How would you know that what you're doing is worthy of submission? People, in my research, that is one thing that is shockingly apparent. People take what they do as unremarkable means to an obvious end. And they are inventing stuff that they literally cannot see it until you point it out. So that's problem one. Problem two
Yeah, I mean, that's
is,
like in academia, right? I mean, if you come up with an idea, the only way that you know that this idea is novel is if you're spending a lot of time, going to the meetings and, reading the journals and you realize, hey, no one else is talking about this, right?
Yes. And the other problem, though, is one of deviance. So by definition, any new practice is out of step with norms and rules and practices. Some of them will just be not the same and therefore fine. It's just, oh, that's new. That's different. But in many cases, there will be in some tension with the appropriate way of doing things around here. And then folks are, as most human beings seem to be doing, according to surveys now, using ChatGPT on their phone at work and not telling a damn soul about it because they're extracting that productivity gain for themselves.
Yes, they don't want anybody to know that they're like, checking out of work at 10 a.m.
Students are doing that. They're passing off their homework as if they did it, not saying anything, and workers are doing the same. And so you have to go to extreme lengths, actually. Much more extreme than that to surface that kind of stuff. Monetary rewards, Ethan and I are aligned on that. Like, what about 10 grand for the most useful failure and success? Failure's critical. Like, I have found a colossally stupid and wasteful use of AI that looks great. That I would pay a lot of money for in a big organization, just as much as here's an innovation and so on. So I think we have to be more aggressive and innovative about ways of this sort of discovering these kind of things.
Yeah. Now, of course, Ethan also describes these new Gen AI tools as basically interns, right? I mean, yeah, they need a little, reward function and so forth, like an intern. But then the question is, well, okay, if we have these wonderful interns, why do we need real interns?
Yep. Well, and he raises that right in his book. He's consumed my research just as very carefully, and he reached out to me and said, "I'm going to basically write a chapter about the stuff that you've been like." My TED Talk came out in 2018, 19, but my study was published in online 2015, 2016. So. He and I both strongly agree that if left unfettered, you're just going to have the problem that I found in robotic surgery ramified, say, 3-4 orders of magnitude more across the global economy. That means something approximating 1 billion working adults are going to have this incentive now to work alone without a novice. That's a $1 trillion problem.
Well, I think it's going to mean more time in school because people are going to think, well, okay, we can somehow bake into formal education what is being squeezed out of the workplace.
Yeah, well, and I can tell you what I'm finding in surgery, which is really interesting, which is that's not happening. What is happening, though, is remedial training once you arrive in a job where you should be fully competent, with euphemisms to cover for that. So you arrive and you receive proctoring, or a brief sabbatical, or they have different names for. You're arriving, you should be fit for duty. Everyone recognizes you are not a capable robotic surgeon yet, because all you did was sit and watch people do it, really. So we are going to take a senior surgeon who can do the job offline to work with you for the first 3 months and really actually mentor you. That's a cost that the destination institution absorbs. And so anyway, there'll be different creative ways of managing the problem, upstream, downstream, but yeah, it's a problem.
But what technology taketh, it also giveth, right? And, the idea that we can do simulations, realistic simulations, I mean, this is something which is exploding, right? Whether it's, and, the use of AR, VR, and so forth. I remember reading this fantastic analysis of or study that was done on flight attendants and how, when they go through this virtual safety episode, right, fire on the plane or so forth. I mean, the simulate. I mean, this is not the kind of thing that you can apprentice on, right? It's not like, oh, well, yeah, this happens all the time. Whenever you have these fires, but you could actually run them through these virtual simulations, and that would give them the kind of training that they wouldn't otherwise get.
Right. So now you're poking directly at the territory that is in the last chapter of my book, right? Yeah. So if you just take currently available tech, assume nothing new, and put it together differently, I believe we have on the table the components that we would need for an infrastructure that would do multiple things like what you just said. To take a couple other orthogonal examples, like what about better, higher frequency, finer grained matches between experts and novices across the global economy? Like you've got some junior person looking to get better at Y, and they're working on project N, and it turns out somebody in Jakarta actually has done that before, and we can make a match, whether or not they're in the same organization. Right. And AI can, well-tuned machine learning-based system could make matches much more rapidly and better. Also, you can look at the current crop of generative AI, and there are ways of doing all of what I'm saying in horrifically dehumanizing ways. But there are also ways of doing it that are positive. You could easily imagine a version of Gen AI now. Like the next wave is agentic AI. Everybody's talking about now, at least on Twitter. And I do think that's coming. Basically, ChatGPT with a memory and the ability to come up with its own plan and creatively resolve problems en route to finishing that plan, including modifying the plan. And if that's the case, then you could imagine such an agent being responsible for your learning and development, having digested all of your prior work and making proactive suggestions to you about what you might go do, including other human beings you might connect with. Right. And then that agent could go talk to somebody else's agent and say, hey, can I connect you to that kind of thing? So there could be a whole new sort of more proactive substrate, digital substrate that could pave the way for learning experiences for all of us. And by the way, that are connected to real problems, getting real work done that produce revenue or save lives. Anyway, I think it's all quite feasible. It's just we need investment.
Well, look, I can imagine how technology and simulation might replicate to some degree the, complexity and the challenge of learning, but the connection piece. I find it difficult to believe that you would have the same kind of relationship with a virtual mentor as with a real mentor. And even a human mentor that's at distance, I have difficulty. Now, of course, we all know that people are falling in love with their, with these avatars and so forth.
There you go. I think
who am I to say? Maybe we can have virtual, but talk about the connection bit a little bit and the importance of good mentorship. And it seems to me that when it comes to mentorship, being a good mentor, that itself is like a techne.
Yes, it is.
And if you haven't learned how to be a good mentor from a good mentor, then the whole chain of transmission will end at some point.
That's right. Yes, and I didn't even define a connection is the third of the 3 C's strictly required for healthy skill development, and it is a warm bond of trust and respect between human beings, which we don't often think of as integral to developing skill, but that's integral in 2 ways. Practically, one is access. If you want to get better at something, and I'm an expert, you have to earn my trust and respect to get a shot. I have to give you the job. I have to allow you in the room, whatever. But the other one is motivation, right? So humans like to produce effects in the world, and that's part of the motivation for skill. But part of it is status. Part of it is feeling like you fit in the social order. And so it is just intrinsically meaningful for us to earn the trust and respect of people who are better at something than us. I used to be in sales. A sales guy I knew in another organization, he said, the most meaningful trophy on my shelf is a wadded up piece of paper from a very cranky boss that I used to have that said, that was a pretty good year, in his handwriting. And so pursuing that kind of connection is, humans will, unless we change our wetware, we're always going to value that. And your journey to skill will proceed through those kinds of connections. And so ignoring that or trying to supplant it, or presuming that it will be supplanted digitally across the human, non-human divide is a much bigger leap. And yet, as you say, we have replica. And so it's not, well, fast forward 40 years. In 40 years, could there be meaningful connections of the kind that I just described across that divide? It is not obvious to me that is impossible. But in the short run, There are so many potential healthy connections to be built that technology could enable between humans, especially in this age when we have destroyed so many of them through this digitally mediated world we work in now. Rebuilding some of those is just low-hanging fruit. Like, can't AI just help us get back connected to one another in this bond of trust and respect sense? Yes. Now, there's a key distinction you raised there around the mentorship. Mentorship is a small subset of this expert-novice connection. I think it's really important to say. Most folks' skill development does not proceed through mentorship, at least as it's academically conceived. That is a long-term relationship that crosses the personal and professional boundary, spans multiple career phases, and so on. And there is an entire skill set around that, as you say, but there's also a skill set of just a single short-lived expert-novice collaborative interaction. How do you work with a novice as an expert? There's in 20 minutes, there's skill associated with that. And there's skill at being a novice too, by the way. So I think there's a whole, I'm talking with consultancies now that, brand name consultancies that have invested many hundreds of millions of dollars over the last 30 years in understanding how to do that well from both sides and training themselves and their clients on that so that they can enhance this informal connection. There's no doubt about it that we can get better at that. AI could help us do that and to forge those bonds. It seems like we have to anyway.
Yeah, I mean, on the motivational side, it's remarkable how even if you are in a business where you have direct interaction with your customer, right? Suppose you're working in a hospital or you are working in a university, you have students, you have patients. If you don't respect the people in the organization that you work for, or you don't trust them, and if they don't seem to appreciate you, I mean, it demotivates people, in ways that are incredibly harmful to the students and the patients. And it doesn't seem like when it comes to performance evaluation, we put enough emphasis on these sorts of, we call it leadership, right, in the business world, but it's far more than leadership. I mean, whether it's mentorship, whether it's inspiration, whether it's gaining the trust and respect of the people who work for you. I mean, how could we bake that into performance evaluation?
Yeah, that to me is an unanswered and really powerful question. I don't know. It is conceptually obvious that would be very valuable and that it is possible. And it doesn't seem like it would take a lot of effort, actually. I mean, you mentioned, I forget if it was off air or on air, like you read my book and you thought, oh, I want more. That would be another potential chapter. Like, okay, because I have a chapter called Reworking the Skill Code, which is about like, all right, fine. You bought the argument up to now. What could you actually go do and change to try to bake this stuff into reality now so that you can push the vector in the right direction? And I left a ton on the cutting room floor there, like performance evaluation structures, data. And that gets down to like, what data do you collect actually? And what constitutes data? What are you even measuring in the first place? There's work to be done in writing that up.
If you're a salesperson and you spend time coaching other salespeople and helping them, I mean, it's gonna hurt your numbers. For sure, right? So
unless you get royalties on your mentees' deals or something, right? I mean, sales is wonderful in that way. You could find performance because, in fact, the organization is getting royalties on your mentorship of those people. What if you shared? What if you took 1%? Just say 1%, something like that. And it was on paper, and it wasn't your performance eval; it's just cash. Right? You do good mentorship and they make money. Guess what? That's how partners work in large consulting firms practically. Towards the end, you start to reap giant returns. And those are, you can look at those numbers and go, that's ridiculous. But if you think of it as an implied rent on the mentorship that you've done to build bench strength, then those numbers could start to seem more reasonable anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of the next frontier in HR analytics, right? So, we've made a lot of progress on measuring individual contribution, and we're only now sort of scratching the surface when it comes to sort of lateral contribution, right? I mean, we see it in sports. So, we know
Right.
how to evaluate a basketball player who doesn't score any points, but his teammates score more points, right?
Yes.
So it's not going to be long before we should be able to evaluate this in some way in the workplace.
Yes. Yeah. And in the end, this is why I have a Substack at wildworldofwork.org. I'd be remiss in not saying that, because essentially every entry there is an extra chapter that I couldn't fit in the book. And I've been writing it since last October. And new ones as they come up. And ultimately, the most recent post is I sort of thought my way into being a measurement guy, I think, because we just need new cost-effective ways of showing that these dynamics are occurring, number one, and number two, that they have implications for business performance or organizational performance or occupational performance. And that there are trade-offs to be made between the, holy target of productivity, which is we've just gotten in the habit of measuring and made it cost-effective to measure productivity and so on. But if that's coming at the expense of development of novice talent, could we objectively measure that in an equally cost-effective way? If I can invent a measure and try to work on that end of the continuum, I feel like that's the high leverage move for me, so that the world can just at least see this deal that it's striking with itself about talent development times productivity. It's a joint optimization problem, basically. But without that cheap metric, you can't do it.
I mean, there's been a lot of studies on things like call center employees where it's relatively easy to measure productivity. You referenced some of them, and I know some of my friends have done these studies on, having coordinated coffee breaks, and boom, boost to productivity, or, taking the most productive people and dispersing them through the floor so that the less productive people are kind of exposed, right, through osmosis to these, high productivity ways of doing things. It would be great if we could kind of scale that up at the managerial level, right? Yeah. where the objective function is a little more difficult to measure.
Yes, and it is currently difficult to measure. And how much investment would it take to create a measure that was cost effective? This is just an instance in a class of the evidence that I collected around our underinvestment in understanding and in being able to manipulate and control this informal relationship at work that actually undergirds our skill, that does deliver value. If that 500 billion that you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, in fact, because novices are necessary, organizations invest bupkis in that relationship, understanding it, trying to amplify it, because they can take it for granted. If novices are necessary, they've lost the thread on is that they are no longer often necessary. And so that machine is broken and they're not investing. Now an investment is really, really urgent to understand how that works, to come up with metrics around it, to see where it's healthy, where it's not. Because of course it's not going to be universally unhealthy. I mean, it's just, we don't know. It's like driving without a front, without some mirror in the vehicle. So new data, and that will help us decide, but that takes investment. If I could just get 1% of that $500 billion, $1 billion, or how about 1/1000th of 1% to invest in this direction, I think the global economy would be much better off really fast.
Yeah, I mean, at the academic level, we evaluate professors based on their publications. We should probably incorporate the publications of their PhD students, right, to some degree, even if they're not co-authors. Maybe one day we'll have a Nobel Prize for professors who haven't themselves made any discoveries, but they have a huge number of PhD students that have gone on to make huge discoveries.
Yeah, you'd need to separate the selection versus the treatment effect there because they're getting top talent, blah, blah, blah. But if there was some way to do that to show that aside from the quality of the stock, your mentorship made a difference, that would be pretty cool.
Now, one thing we didn't talk about is remote work. And I just interviewed Nick Bloom, and we talked a lot about this. And, we have a lot of data, right, on the impact of remote work. What can we learn from this recent natural experiment around remote work with respect to transmission of know-how?
Right. I mentioned the available research I could find in the book at the time on this, which was limited, and I still think it's quite limited. But in short, the answer there is that there is a significant negative effect on your, it's not operationalized as skill, but stuff that's quite proximate to skill, your next assignment, sort of career implications, projects you might get on, and so on. So I think it's reasonable, but underdone conclusion that remote work is toxic to that collaborative bond, especially the connection part. We do have great research now showing effects associated with proximate concepts, things like loneliness, things like collaborative interaction, and so on. The anecdotal inflow to me about this book, it's interesting. At least 10% of it, maybe 15, is from parents who have 20-something kids at work now who can't find a mentor to save their life. Is a big error. Like, that's a literal quote from one of them, but that's the bottom line story. Like, they went to this job to learn. Everyone knows that's the deal, and yet now they're not getting to play. They barely get involved, or they feel like they're a script monkey or a ChatGPT monkey. So anyway, I don't think we have a really good study on that. I think part of the reason for that is, in fact, remote work unleashes learning opportunities as well. Digitally mediated interaction unleashes all kinds of access to stuff that can help you learn. So, and a hybrid situation, many hybrid situations will be better than a strictly co-located or strictly digital solution. So it's going to be hard. I look forward to science on that front. I'm not doing it myself, but I think it's reasonable. The reasonable supposition is, in general, remote work. I'm certainly hearing this from the executives I'm talking to now. Remote work seems to make it really hard for that junior person to kind of get involved and build their career.
Well, last question. I mean, we've been looking at this primarily from the organizational perspective, but what about from the learner's perspective? I mean, you talk about these shadow learners, the folks who kind of, and sort of some rule breakers, right? People who, they're not passively waiting for knowledge transmission to be served up to them on a silver platter. They're sort of out there sticking their nose into things where they, maybe it doesn't belong. How can, if you're trying to tell your students how to go out there and become one of these ladder climbers, how can we advise them to do it without getting themselves fired?
Right, exactly. Or yeah, exactly. I have a post on my Substack called "Don't Let AI Dumb You Down." That was in October of last year, after I made extensive and very uncomfortable use of AI mandatory for my master's students. And I think that's part of the way. So if you have the authority to mandate deviance in a controlled setting, do it immediately. Like, presume, the safe presumption is, if standard ways of building skill are getting blocked by all the mechanisms we've been talking about, you can assume that a small subset will bend and break rules to get the skill that they need, because humans value competence. And that's a theory from 1940. Merton gave us that one, that people will a few will, if there's a valued goal out there, they'll deviate.
So they'll ask for forgiveness and not permission, right?
Or they will just avoid detection. They won't even ask, or they won't even consider what they're doing deviant. They'll just do it to get that result. And then, if you ask them, they'll go, oh yeah, I guess that wasn't too good. So assume that and manufacture it. Hit the gas. If you have any authority for yourself, find ways to do stuff that make you uncomfortable, that strain against the bounds of propriety, and that are recoverable. But more to the point, if you manage a group, or if you're a leader in an organization, I know I'm steering away from the individual. The individual is in a tough spot. The first third of my book is my best answer to someone who doesn't like breaking rules, right? Because those shadow learners were fighting for something. They're sticking their necks out to preserve something important. And if I looked across my evidence and all the available research, those 3 C's, in fact, are the things that they're fighting to protect, that they're willing to take that risk for. So that's my best sort of separation of the baby and the bathwater for the generic reader who's like, I don't want to lose my job or get in trouble. What do I need to look for to preserve my healthy skill development? That's the answer behind all the deviance. Now, there are particularities of the tactics that are really inventive and useful and that we need to know. This is like Ethan's book of spells. And those are going to be local to contexts, occupations, organizations, professions, what have you. And you need to find other ways to figure out what those tricks are. But the general operating system, what do you need to, as an individual looking out for your own skill development or your kids, is those 3 C's. Look at a context, a job, a gig, a project. Are those 3 things in healthy supply? And if so, where? Why? How could I scale them? If not, maybe avoid, right? I mean, you get choice. You want to cultivate those conditions wherever you land, basically.
So when you do your job interview, I mean, those seem like the kinds of questions you'd want to ask, right? I mean,
exactly
how are you? Yeah.
Yeah, savvy residents, by the way, when I started my field research in 2013, really savvy inbound residents who had choice about where to land, they would ask a very intelligent question, which is not, do you have a robot, but how much time will I get on the console operating? Right. They already knew the word was out on the street, and they would avoid high status institutions where the surgeon did most of the work and land in very strange places that you wouldn't on paper think are high status. They aren't, but they would get to operate a lot. And they knew that because they wanted to get good. So the market kind of figures this out in the long run, but that privileges those who have social access to that kind of information and social connections to learn and ask those questions. It's not an efficient system.
Yeah. Well, you're not advising, of course, people, when the doctor's out doing a bathroom break, that you go in and start, slicing away.
No, right? To the contrary. But the rule breakers are really useful in that learning takes time. You can't just deviate once and walk away with some jewels. It's not a jewel heist. Learning skill development takes time. So if you're willing to persistently, in some cases for years, bend and break rules to try to build skill, what you're doing better work really well because you're sticking your neck out day in and day out. So that's why I think it's really useful. They're protecting only the critical core. You would only do that persistently for something that really was critical to your skill development.
Yeah, I remember when I was in grad school, I had these professors as mentors, advisors who, they would frequently travel out of town, go to conferences, and have me teach their classes for them. And I don't think they were supposed to do that. I don't think I was supposed to do that, but it was very critical to my development as a teacher. It was scary. It was, super scary as a, 20-year-old to be doing that stuff, but it was super helpful to me.
Brilliant. And they're the deviant in that case.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
I guess you jointly did it.
Yeah. Well, Matt, thanks so much for joining me. It's really a fantastic book. As I said, there's so much more in here. Each little nugget sent me on a kind of click trail to go and investigate a lot of the original research that inspired your work. And we didn't mention, but there's a whole bunch of stories and anecdotes about specific individuals that you observed who did a lot of the things that you talk about. So I highly recommend the book, Skill Code. Thanks so much for joining me. We'll talk again soon.
All right. Thank you very much, Greg. Really, this is a great conversation. Really appreciate the invite.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.